1955. And then it was a very perturbed period for the company. There was the lawsuit with Mobil. Houdry had sued that there was a conspiracy to destroy the Houdry company. At that time, Eugene Houdry had left the company. The Houdry settled out of court favorably. They never did come to court, but we got, if I remember correctly, an $8 million settlement, which was a lot of money in that time. Houdry at that time was owned by Sun Oil, and Sun Oil apparently made the decision to divest itself of Houdry. So the business aspects were at that time very interesting. The stock went from about 11 to 75, a number of key people sold, and Air Products bought the company. Within the company, this was a very turbulent period. A lot of key people left. At that time we had men like Harold Shallett, Sal Weller, who left. Albert Herrick was laid off. He's the one that invented Dabco, the polyurethane catalyst. And that was an accident, by the way. Dabco, we were trying to make piperidine at the time, and this was a byproduct. And nobody knew what it was good for. Al Herrick ran around that he had found birdcage, triethylene diamine, which we later learned named diazobicyclooctane, and that's the Dabco abbreviation. But I can remember the day he was laid off. They called the company, everyone in the company together, and announced who was going to leave. And as Herrick went out the door, he said, "Don't forget Dabco, don't forget Dabco," or birdcage as he called it. Well, turned out they called Milton Orkin in to consult, and what do we do with a molecule like this? And Milton Orkin looked at it and said, "Why don't you use it for a polyurethane catalyst?" Just like that. Just so many words. And of course, it was millions and millions of dollars and the best polyurethane catalyst that was ever found. So that got Houdry very nicely into the Dabco business. In the meantime, it was leaving the catalytic cracking business slowly and painfully. Eugene Houdry had made a statement that fluidized beds had no place at Houdry, and so we persisted with the moving bed technology. And as things developed, only very small units in very odd locations could be justified economically. In the meantime, Sun Oil bought a fluid cat cracker from UOP. That was the arch fiend, the arch enemy of Houdry. And we could look out the windows of the Houdry laboratories down to the Sun Oil refinery and see this cat cracker being built. And I guess the blackest day ever at Houdry was when the cracker went on stream. Everybody's hanging out the windows. Maybe it'll blow up, or maybe it'll never work. But that was the signal that Sun just had no further interest in Houdry. Before, they would have lost money rather than purchase from UOP. Now, Alex Mills at that time was director of research. The research department and the development department, I could never see the difference. You started work on a process idea, and you had to start small, and you never did get too big before it was a licensable process. My interests at the time were in hydrodesulfurization of coke oven light oil. This was a small business that coke oven light oil at the time was the sole source of benzene and toluene in the 50s. I think toluene was $2 a gallon and benzene was $1 a gallon. When the reformers came on, they were making literally chemically pure toluene and benzene for maybe 17 cents a gallon for the toluene and 35 cents for the benzene. So that put the coke oven people out of business, and this gave Houdry an opportunity to develop a hydrodealkylation and hydrodesulfurization, a combined process. So that was my big interest at Houdry, and from that we went into toluene dealkylation. And then, as I was leaving, more interest in hydrodesulfurization developed. Also, the butadiene process had just been released about the time I arrived by the government that units could be built. During the wartime, it was a government-controlled process, and it was impossible to license butadiene units. Well, this was big business for Houdry, an amazing technology, huge reactors operating cyclically. They're still very economic. Butane is dehydrogenated butadiene. And we had major programs of trying to improve the selectivity of that process, and made some small gains, but never did get much past what Eugene Houdry had developed at the start. My inclination on Eugene Houdry was the really great things that were done in the company. The catalytic cracking was his concept, and the butane dehydrogenation. And once he left, nothing really great conceptually came. And there were smaller things. Certainly the Dabco was nothing to be criticized or anything else at the company. But it was far smaller scale conceptually than what Houdry did. They tell great stories of him working around the clock, of anybody who worked closely enough with him had to be fired at least once by him and hired in a few hours again. But he was a tyrant, but a very brilliant tyrant. That kind of leadership, of course, left when he left. And then when Air Products purchased the company, there was a very strong intention to change the direction of the company. Leonard Poole, who was president of Air Products at the time, made the statement of, why sell the cow when you can sell the milk, which translated into, why license processes when you can sell the chemicals. This made a big hiatus in process research and development in Houdry, and was the period where most of the, shall we say, old-timers left, and the company put on a new face and became eventually assimilated into Air Products.
Who would have been some of those old faces that left when Air Products came?
Well, as I say, in the research department, Alex Mills was head of it, and he had Harold Shallett as a group leader. Harold went on to Arco, maybe not because of Air Products, but nevertheless because of the changing nature of the company. Jerry Hinden was very active. Jerry left for city service in, I think, Lake Charles, Louisiana. And Jerry, of course, and his wife were very sophisticated New Yorkers And this was a big decision to go down to Louisiana, especially in the 50s when it wasn't that civilized down there. And they tell the story that Jerry rented a house in Lake Charles, and his wife came down separately and arrived at about the same time as the moving van. And she unlocked the door for the movers and walked in, and there was a moccasin in the middle of the living room floor looking at her. And it's told that she got in her car and drove back to New Jersey and refused to live in Louisiana, and city service had to transfer him up to Jersey. So that was the story of Jerry Hinden. Now, we had some very interesting people, not the time. When I arrived, there was a gentleman named Walter Savornin who had received an overdose of radiation during the atom bomb tests. And Walter was programmed to die. He was doing some very nice catalysis research. And as he went along, the insurance company decided that he was terminal, gave him his insurance. He went, had his nerves in his spine severed so he would not feel the pain, and basically spent his last few months at his house seeing all his old friends and colleagues, and passed away very sadly from the radiation. We had at that time, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he worked for Ted Cornelius, and Ted used to make the catalyst, and he was more or less the expert in that area. Marty Kapp worked at Houdry at that time, and he went on subsequently to found his own chemical company up in Erie, Pennsylvania. But Marty Kapp was working in Paulsboro. Houdry still had their catalyst plant on the mobile premises, in spite of the lawsuit. And every day, Marty Kapp would go to work. He lived on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River in Media or somewhere around there, and would take the ferry over to the Jersey side from Chester and go to work in Paulsboro. Well, one day Marty saw a friend on the ferry and went over and started talking to him, and they got to the Jersey side and they drove off to work. And around lunchtime, Marty remembered he'd left his car on the ferry. Well, they drove back to the ferry, and of course he had to pay for each and every trip that his car took while he was away, and they were very furious about it. Apparently the Coast Guard had already started dragging for him, and it was a cause célèbre for a while. Well, anyway, Marty went off to found Calcicat Chemical Company, and he started on a shoestring in a garage. And at that time, well, Marty was these were the catalyst preparation and manufacturing people, Cornelius, Savorn, and Kapp. Then in the process research, Harold Shallett headed up that group. Burt Farkas was there, and he headed up actually trying to make some of these specialty chemicals, piperazine, and later optimizing that process to produce the byproduct Dabco, and forget about the piperazine, which wasn't attractive anymore. The Jerry Hinden, as I say, worked for Farkas at that time on the chemicals. Now, In the development, John Merker headed up the process development, and Lou Dolp was a group leader. I was one of their project development engineers, and Tom Michael was in that group. We worked very closely with the technical service, with the sales, because there was a lot of pressure once you had an idea and got it developed, is to get it out and get it licensed. So we worked with men like Buck Cross, Don Wormeldorf, who were in the technical service, Giulio Ciccolisi in the design, Lee Friedman, and there was a lot of interaction between Houdry and its design group, which was located in Philadelphia, the design and sales. The laboratories were in Linwood. Now, I might add, at that time, Houdry owned Catalytic, but it was like the tail wagging the dog. Catalytic was huge, and we really never had any contact with them. They were totally a separate entity. But anyhow, I might just say that when we developed the process, one of the big problems was to get the first customer, get someone who was willing to try it out for the first time. And so this was one of the reasons that Houdry was so very scientifically productive. In other words, they felt that one way to get customer confidence was to publish technical papers and more or less a best foot forward. We're scientifically expert as well as technological experts. And so I was very much encouraged, as were other people there, to publish and to make a name for ourselves in the fields of the processes we were working on. The salesmen loved to take the technical people around, and the customers loved to, when Houdry salesmen came, because this was these were refineries in strange locations, and this was their chance to get a big meal and get drunk. And they would proceed to do that with every customer. The group would come from the refinery, be literally a party in a restaurant, and they would try and pump me for secrets of the process. And I had to learn to drink and not tell secrets. If you couldn't do that, then you couldn't really work at Houdry at that time, or at least you couldn't work with the salesman. Well, anyway, just to show you how a process went, I did some very small-scale experiments on toluene hydrodealkylation, realized it was the basis for a process, put in a patent proposal, which was promptly rejected on the basis that why would anybody want to make benzene out of toluene. Some more thought, they changed their mind, and we went rather fast and within 6 months from the first experiment, we had enough data to design a project. This was like 1959. So we didn't have any computer in the company at that time. We went up to Drexel University and worked together with them and threw the kinetic data onto the computer and actually came up with a design package. And as I say, in 6 months, we had this on the market, and the salesmen were taking me from meeting to meeting to present my story of the process, and from company to company. Eventually, we did find a refinery that took it as the first unit, which we gave royalty free. And I, as the developing engineer, got very involved then in the plant design and construction and in the startup. So from the point of view of someone who was interested in the field of catalysis, Houdry more or less gave me certainly an opportunity to go from the very first initial experiment, through the patent process, through the development, through the sales, through every aspect of a process, and I can say it was quite an education. And I think the other young people at that time that were in process development were doing much the same thing as they developed processes.
Who was it that asked Orkin, what could you do with Dabco?
Well, this would have been a meeting with the research people that were involved with Dabco. As I say, it was discovered by L. Herrick, and he was working with Mills and with Farkas at the time. I guess Weller might have been in on that. It was before Weller left. So this would have been the group. Shallot, the whole research department was focusing on this new chemical that they had found. And that was something new for Houdry, to find a chemical. The Houdry was more petroleum and petrochemical processes, and here to come up with a chemical. And of course it was very iffy. What do you do with this byproduct? Nobody had any hopes for the byproduct at the time. It was more or less an aside, a question like that. The real question was piperazine, and they had great plans of producing lots of piperazine, which they were going to feed to chickens, and the chickens wouldn't have worms. There was just no idea of this byproduct except it was reducing the selectivity of the process. Piperazine has 2 nitrogens and 2 ethylenes, and Dabco has 2 nitrogens and 3 ethylenes. And there's, why are we making this, and how can we avoid making it, and what would it be good for? And I think it was much in that context that it was asked to Milton Orkin, but it was just a stroke of genius on his part. He just very casually said it and went on about his business.
Was Wheeler there while you were there?
Yes, at the very start. Wheeler, I got there in '55, and Wheeler was very avant. He lived in Arden, Delaware, which was an artist colony, and a very bohemian sort of community, and he was a very bohemian sort of guy, and he really was not understood by many of the people there. He was just so far ahead in some of his thinking on diffusion and transport. Well, he was drinking very heavily. In fact, to the point that they fired him. And that was a very black day indeed that he left Houdry. He wound up on the West Coast and was working at, I believe, Aeroneutronics in Palo Alto. And the last time I saw him, but again, the last time I saw him was about 1967, and he had left Houdry about 1958.
How did Saul Weller come to Houdry from Bureau of Mines? Do you know?
No, Saul was there when I arrived. Saul Weller was at Houdry. He was doing very fundamental studies at the time on platinum on alumina. This is just when reforming came out. Again, 1955. It was quite an interesting year for petrochemicals and petroleum. Anyway, Houdry did not have a catalyst, did not have any position at all. And it was a frantic rush to come up with a reforming catalyst. And as I remember, he was pretty much in charge of that work and trying to understand what the platinum alumina catalysts were all about.
Do you know why Farkas left Babbitt and came to Houdry?
I suppose he was at Allied. He was at Allied, as I understand. the coal tar division there. And they were never had a reputation as being a very nice outfit to work for. And Barrett is the outfit he was exactly with, the Barrett division of Allied. And they were having their own troubles, and I think he saw a much better opportunity to do some serious work at Houdry. And he did. He came into Houdry, and he did some very fine work in more in the chemicals rather than in the petrochemicals or petroleum.
What sort of a person was he as he approached research? Very methodical or jump about from?
As far as, I don't know what you want from me. You could never pin him down on anything. He had this wonderful Hungarian accent. He was a scientist in the true sense of the word. And he was more of an administrator at Houdry than he was a hands-on scientist, which was a little bit of a misuse of his talents. He was just, he should have done more in the laboratory, I thought, than running a group of people.
Well, now, did Houdry still come to the lab while you were there?
Oh, no. When Houdry left, it was a real power play at the time, and as I say, this was before my arrival. But he left, and it was quite permanent, and I never saw him once in the laboratories or offices or anywhere at Houdry. He formed his own little company out on the main line near Philadelphia, and apparently made his success again. And again, there were some very colorful stories about him enriching the oxygen in his bedroom and taking massive amounts of vitamin C like Pauling did. But he got into the catalytic muffler, which Houdry was not in the 50s. Subsequently, Houdry got interested in that.
Did you come to Houdry right out of school, or had you worked elsewhere?
No. I actually, when I got to Houdry, I had a master's in chemical engineering that I had just gotten in night school at Newark College of Engineering. So I went to work for a little company in Westchester, Pennsylvania for a couple months, decided I hated it, and this was somewhere around January of '55. I left them, and I went around and for about 2 weeks took interviews at various companies in the Wilmington area because we had moved to Wilmington. And I was originally from the Chester, Wilmington area anyway, and I liked the idea of being somewhere in that environment. So Houdry was one of the companies I interviewed and got an offer from. I had several offers to make up my mind. And I decided, gee, that's a nice sized company. They do interesting things. I don't quite understand what they do, but let's find out about it. So I went to work at Houdry, and the first thing they put me on was butane dehydrogenation. And I might add, that's the last thing I worked on before I left. But anyway, I had worked at Colgate-Palmolive before, and it was there we made detergent, and you felt that if it was sticky, you threw it in the air, see if it was dusty, you smelled it if it smelled right. You were really very intimate with your product. And I remember my first bulb of butadiene from the pilot unit, and I looked, and it's an invisible gas, and I couldn't see a thing. And I was absolutely wonderstruck with the whole idea that there are chemicals and products in this invisible gas. So I got more and more interested in Houdry and the catalysis as I worked there. And then I stayed there about 10 years, and then finally decided to go back and get a PhD with Newt Krieger at Penn. And because I felt I I was just really learning the edges of catalysis, and I really wanted to get into it deeply. So that's why I left Houdry. Not that there was any problem with the work or anything like that. It was that I just felt I had to know more about what was going on. But no, I didn't even know what Houdry did when I started work for them.
Do you think that it was forces from external to the Houdry labs, or was it the follow-up to Houdry leaving that caused it to decline gradually?
Well, the first of all, once they got themselves settled with mobile, Sun Oil put Ted Burtis in as president, and the company was losing money. Now this was just strictly from a business point of view. Sun owned half the stock. I think it might have even been 51% of the stock. And there really wasn't that much available on the open market because certain groups and interests had other blocks of stock. But anyway, it was a very easy stock to manipulate. Well, what was done is that's when the big layoff of people occurred when Burtis became president. And by taking away a number of salaries, they were able to shift the company from a red position or deficit to a profitable position on paper. Now, obviously, there weren't as many people in the laboratory to do the work, and it was quite a difficult thing. But for business reasons then, the company was made attractive economically. Now, this had a big impact on how much could be achieved there. So there were less people at Houdry, and so the work slowed down a little bit at that time as a consequence, or at least the output slowed down, so we put it that way. Then, once the company looked profitable and was sold to Air Product, you faced a management with totally different ideas. I mean, this management didn't understand the licensing business. They understood selling products, and they wanted products. They wanted to shift the laboratory more to a product-oriented business. There was a good bit of resistance in the laboratory at the time. There were people who just only wanted to do process work, and there were new people brought in to do the chemicals work, along with Farkas. Farkas was one that was brought in for chemicals work. So, but there was a whole shift in direction of the company. There were a lot of research projects, I felt, before all this happened, that were basically very, very fundamental, with no way that I could see that they were related to the company's business, but were good for publishing. And so, of course, all of that seemed to stop in a hurry once Air Products took over. And the company just changed its nature totally.
What sort of organizational structure did it have? Was it loose, or was it very rigid, very departmentalized?
Not really. See, this is before we knew about profit centers and that sort of thing. So the organization was, there was a director of research and a director of development, and each had a few group leaders, maybe 3-4 group leaders, and then each of these groups had 3 or 4 people, maybe 6, depending on the group, in the laboratory. So that I think all told there were maybe only 80 technical people in the Linwood laboratories of Houdry. And there was an analytical department that was very nice and accommodating. The Everything was on a very first name basis. Everybody knew everyone, and there was a little bit of competition between research department and development department, but not anything serious or troublemaking. It was just sort of an esprit thing. But I would say that as today's organizations go, it was totally different. It was almost academic. I mean, we were obviously expected to produce saleable processes and products, but there were people there that were doing very fundamental studies, more than I think the company could sustain. There were people there that were doing very pedestrian type of catalyst testing or development studies. Change 1-2 variables and see what happens and try and accommodate a customer's particular feed or something. So there was a whole gamut of activity, but hardly what eventually developed as the Air Products ultimately put in profit centers, where if it didn't work out, I suppose the people would disappear. It was nothing like that.
Had Oblet already left when you were there?
No, Alex was vice president of research, and Mills worked for him. Now, Jack Dart was also a vice president, but I think in sales and engineering rather than research. Now, Houdry looked very hard at the time to see where it could go, and tried some little contract research. There was also a contract research group that was more or less Oblat's pet. He put Heinz Heinemann in charge of that. And Heinz Heinemann had a guy named Joe Donovan working for him. And they had this little contract research group, and it did not do that much. But that was Heinemann's big activity for a number of years before he left. He left, I'm not quite sure the circumstances, but he went on up to M.W. Kellogg. I think Heinemann began having trouble with the Air Products people, and I think Farkas did. I think most Air Products wanted to move their own management in, and the first thing they did was they moved the vice president of research in, Tom Gresham. And Tom began manipulating the organization. That's the old story of a takeover.
What sort of person was Oblat and Heinemann?
Well, Oblat was always very pleasant. He was a fantastic businessman. He apparently had investments on the side in finance companies and such, and made himself quite a wealthy man at Houdry. The same with Dart, Jack Dart. These were some very, in spite of their technical abilities, they were very entrepreneurial people. Ted Burtis was, on my understanding, a rather wealthy gentleman. Dart was, but Oblat, of course, was in the top management, and we didn't see him that much in the laboratory, although I gather that Heinemann, Mills, Oblat, Weller worked rather closely and were putting each other on papers, collaborating on papers together, and had their own thing going. This is one of the things, the exodus of Heinemann and Oblat, Weller was all at about the same time, and this was part of the new management bearing down very heavy.
Now, when they were there and doing the research and publishing, did the other people look at this as an elitist group, or did they accept this as good for the company?
Well, I don't. There were always people complaining about something. You'll find people complain about everything. I minded my own business, or at least I tried, and I didn't draw any opinions about them. I would say, though, they provided, in a way, the kind of role model that the company needed and wasn't getting. It was getting a much more pragmatic group of people in. And in fact, Alex Mills once said to me, he says, you ought to publish some of the things you're doing. I said, oh, I'm going to do that one of these days. He says, no, you're not. He says, you can't write a paper. That's why you're not publishing. And I said, you bum. And I went and I wrote my first paper in Hoosier. But he really, motivated me to do that. But I would say people were criticizing because we missed some boats, and they were very obvious. We missed the reforming boat. We missed the fluid cracking boat. We just didn't do it. We didn't have any place in alkylation. We really had at Hoodry the butadiene saving our necks, the butane dehydrogenation. That saved Hoodry's life. And then the hydrodealkylation became a big money maker for Hoodry, and between dehydrogenation and hydrodealkylation, we were looking in the decade I was there was no real sources of money otherwise. They were selling some reforming units, they were selling some moving bed crackers, but it was the tail end of the business. In other words, whatever UOP didn't get, they were getting. And it wasn't a happy situation. Dehydrogenation saved Hoodry in 1955 when Eisenhower, I guess it was Eisenhower, passed a law that they could license it, and they went into that big.
Now, do you think that this came about because of the Hoodry influence on the people he left behind, such that they didn't go into fluid cracking because of him, or was it something different than that?
Well, it was too late by then. In other words, it was already an established process by the middle 50s, and so it was too late. The same reforming, it was too late. They did come up with a catalyst. Why? They got hold of the UOP catalyst and duplicated it. But it's as simple as that. But reforming, they didn't have anything. They were second. Moving bed cracking, you couldn't compare the economics unless you got in very small refineries. I think, I forget the exact figure, but somewhere around 35,000 barrels a day or something, very small stuff, when they were selling 100,000 barrel a day fluid crackers and up. So they were on the dying end of the moving bed business. They didn't go ahead with the moving bed to look at moving bed reforming, moving bed dehydrogenation, any other process. Just took some ground rules that if the catalyst is expensive, you can't have moving bed or fluid bed. And so that stopped a lot of development work in those areas. So their processes were fixed bed cyclic, say for dehydrogenation, the moving bed for cat cracking, fixed bed, non-cyclic for hydrodealkylation, and then just some conventional hydrodesulfurization reactors and such. So I think as far as coming up with new process concepts, Eugene Houdry made far the greatest contribution to that company. His concept of catalytic cracking, of course, revolutionized the whole catalysis field. His concept of butane dehydrogenation basically created the synthetic rubber industry, and that during the war, there were, I think, 2 small plants, one at Sun Oil and one, I think maybe in Canada, I won't swear. But there were just 2 small plants that were making the synthetic rubber for the country during the war. At one time, the total high-octane gasoline in the war came out of Paulsboro, the moving bed unit. And by the way, this Mobil also owned Houdry at the time. It was Mobil and Son. And so Mobil's catalytic cracking, thermophore catalytic cracking, was competing with Houdry once the company split. And both of them, of course, going down. Houdry did not get into zeolites when they came along. It was not having this innovativeness that was characteristic of Eugene Houdry. As I say, the 2 processes that I invented, the coke oven light oil hydrodesulfurization and the toluene hydrodealkylation, were maybe the only 2, and DABCO also, were the 3 things that came out in a decade.
Well,
that's not much for a company like that.
With the people who were still there in '55, was Houdry still viewed as being held in awe, or had most people forgotten about him?
The only people that held him, that had good things to say, were the people that worked with him directly in the good old days, that worked around the clock with him. But basically, he was regarded as a wonderful scientist and really should not have been president of the company. He was not regarded as a good businessman. He was regarded as a tremendous inventor, a tremendous entrepreneurial type scientist, but as a businessman, and apparently this is one of the reasons that he was forced out by the Mobil and Sun interests. And but there were some very dirty politics at the time, and the company just made its way totally without Houdry. And I think it would have been impossible not to believe that he wasn't the key factor in the company. I mean, cat cracking came from Houdry. Butane dehydrogenation came from Houdry. These were his ideas.
Now, you went on then to work with Krieger at University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Could you describe him?
He was about the nicest man. A very elegant gentleman, very quiet, and he and I had a nice relationship. He ran an institute. For some reason, he got interested in chemical warfare. Why, I never know. But he was guiding chemical warfare research in an institute called the Institute for Cooperative Research at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was super secret. We had top secret and secret things going on. And I remember he gave me a position, a part-time position in the Institute, and also arranged that I had a fellowship in chemistry for my equipment and chemicals. And so I was able to afford, at that time, you know, I had a wife and a couple kids and a couple cars. I wasn't particularly young. I left Udry. I was able to keep myself going financially by working part-time at this Institute of Cooperative Research and building a reaction system in his lab and running the experiments. Well, the project, I was, 35 when I went there. This was just one more project as far as I was concerned, and within 2 years I had a PhD, and I stayed there a third year with him. Well, he had a couple very disastrous things happen. One, he had another graduate student who picked up more or less where I had left off, and this young fellow was killed in some kind of an accident, I think an automobile accident. And this was a very emotional thing for Krieger. Next thing, the hippies on campus were rioting and picketing against the Vietnam War and wanted to get all classified research off campus. Well, they got the school's administration to literally close up his Institute for Cooperative Research. They did
What year was this?
I'd say I left there in '66, so this was 1 year later, '67. They closed up this institute, and a big institute. At that time, he was about $2 million a year, so that was big money then. And he had put his heart and soul into it, and literally was just broken by it. He just withdrew into himself, and he really, between the student dying and this institute being closed up, he more or less stopped his research and just was teaching at a minimum in the physical chemistry department. And actually, I don't think it was 3 years later he died from a heart attack. But he was a delightful man, a very perceptive, but let's say in his last years, his interests for some reason went into this chemical warfare, and very deeply into it. A think tank, by the way. It was not an experimental operation at all. It was purely interdisciplinary. I worked with pharmacists, meteorologists, biologists, you name it. We all worked together, and had nothing to do with catalysis, except in my case, the processes for these things. But that was his all-consuming interest in his last years, and it was stopped on him.
Now, was he the only one in catalysis at Penn at that time?
Yes. Yes, there was, as far as I know, no other activity in chemistry. Now, in chemical engineering, at that time, Frank Dwyer, who's now at Mobile, worked with Lee Eagleton, and I don't know, they did some kind of very classical chemical engineering studies, such as the effect of mixing rate on catalytic reaction and that, but more reaction engineering rather than pure catalysts. And then I think Dan Perlmutter came into Penn at the time, and he got interested in some kinetics and reactor design. But in those days there was not much catalysis around. And I might say, looking for a professorship at that period of time, 1966, 67, this was the period, there's some very interesting things happening. You had your engineering science phenomenon in the universities, where unit operations were no longer of interest, and Now, it was strictly engineering science. I can remember going to an AICHE, well, a Catalysis Society meeting in Houston, and you sit and you listen to the papers then, and every paper, the reaction was surface controlled and kinetics and mechanism, and not a word of transport. And you knew darn well that half the papers being presented were transport control, and the kinetics were nonsense. Then the following Monday, back to back in Houston, they had the AICHE meeting, and it was strictly the engineering scientists, and everything was a black box with chemicals wafting in all directions and wafting out, and not the slightest interest in what the nature of the catalyst or the mechanism involved was. And in fact, there was big movement even to take organic chemistry out of chemical engineering. Who needs it? Math is the thing. Well, so that passed through its fad also. But on top of all that, Linus Pauling made his famous speech that if it's applied chemistry, has no place in chemistry departments. And so the chemistry departments literally stopped hiring catalytic chemists. There were just no appointments to be had for catalytic chemists. In the meantime, the chemical engineering departments, there wasn't much more could be done with the engineering science. Where do we go next? Well, we don't go back to unit ops. Well, applied chemistry is the direction to go. And this is just about the time, this 1967, 1966, that chemical engineering departments began to hire electrochemists and colloid chemists and catalytic chemists. And so catalysis then entered chemical engineering and developed into what we know it was today. But it wasn't any foregone conclusion that you'd find catalysis people in chemical engineering in 1966.
Now, Mills always had a group coming to the Philadelphia Catalyst Club. Did he come around and actively encourage people to go, or was it just interest that did that?
No, I think we used to go from the Houdry laboratories. I guess we could charge the dinner on the expense account for one thing, and they always had it in a wonderful restaurant in Chester, some kind of a club or something near the railroad station. And so we would have a nice dinner, and generally, at least those of us from development, never understood the talks or what they were talking about and why anybody would want to do such fundamental research. But no, it was always a natural turnout. He never packed anything, or anybody else I know. The Catalysis Society, the secret of the Catalysis Society, the local sections, is that they always present high-class technical talks by very high-class people. And we formed our Catalysis Society in New England, and people said, well, there's no industry, there's no catalysis per se in New England, but the Catalysis Society of New England, I organized that when I got there, and in '66, so it's still surviving for 20 years, and we still don't know where the people are working or who's working into catalysis in New England, but as long as it's a high-class talk, a good talk, we get a turnout. And I think that's been the secret of the whole Catalysis Society, is just the caliber of the work and of the speakers that are at these meetings. Anything else? No? Okay. I don't know what else to reminisce.